All right, it's just 1 after 7, so we'll go ahead and get started. So, welcome to Buddhism in a Nutshell. It is a 5-week course. It'll meet the Fridays in March. It will be followed in April with Meditation 101. I believe there's one Friday night in April where it's connected to a weekend retreat. So it won't meet, that class will not meet every Friday in April. Um, those two classes are kind of complementary. They are courses that were developed by an organization that our center, Tupten Norbo Ling, is an affiliate of. That organization is called the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition, or FPMT for short. As I say, Tupten Norbo Ling is an affiliate of that international organization, which was started in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s in Nepal by Lama Zopa Rinpoche and Lama Yeshe, these two Tibetan monks who were living in Nepal at the time because of the invasion of Tibet and the diaspora that occurred subsequent to that. They met with a group of Westerners who were traveling, and this sort of East-West collaboration began. And out of that, FPMT was born with the goal of presenting Tibetan Buddhism, particularly for a Western audience. So our center is steeped in particularly the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. I myself have never studied any other Buddhist tradition, so I can't talk about Zen or Theravada or any of the other traditions because I have no training in any of the other traditions. Our center presents Tibetan Buddhism. So that's the lens or the packaging that all of our teachings will be based on, that particular way of presenting the teachings. It is a Mahayana tradition, and we will, toward the end of today's class, we'll touch a little bit on what that means. So, as I say, this course is a 5-week course, and its purpose is to highlight a broad level overview of Tibetan Buddhist philosophy. The companion course, Meditation 101, is geared, as you might expect, more so toward meditation. The purpose of that class, I always say, is to help people understand how to begin a meditation practice at home, kind of what they might need to know if they were interested in beginning meditation practice at home. So it doesn't touch very much on Buddhist philosophy, and this course doesn't touch very much on meditation. So the two are, as I say, companion courses. There's a third course called Introduction to Mindfulness. These three classes are what we typically cycle through on a monthly basis on Fridays. However, in May, we have 3 Friday nights that are connected to weekend courses. So we're skipping May in terms of the normal schedule. So that class will happen in June. So there's going to be a bit of a break because there are other things happening on Fridays. Okay, so that's just a little bit about the center. As I say, we were talking before, our center is physically located in Santa Fe in New Mexico, just slightly outside the city in Santa Fe. But are there any thoughts or questions so far before we move on? Yes, you can. Yep.
Um, I am curious, do you know when the Discovering Buddhism courses are going to begin?
I don't. We are looking into that right now. We are hoping June. We're targeting June. June is the goal, but I should know more about that shortly.
Do you know what day of the week they usually do those on?
Right. It's likely that we'll continue the current approach, which is Monday nights from 7 to 9.
7 to 9. Okay, that's great.
And
Great.
it's a six, each module, the way that we approach it, each module is 6 weeks in duration, and each module begins the first Monday of every other month. So that means that there's a 2 or sometimes 3 week break in between modules, depending on whether there are 2 or 3 Mondays until you reach the first Monday of the next month.
So you said you do a class and then after that you have 3 weeks in between the next class. Is that what you said?
Yes, because the modules. So each, because discovering
Okay.
Buddhism is composed of
Yeah.
13 modules
Yeah.
or content areas. So each
Yeah.
content area is 6 weeks in duration.
Okay, now I get it. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Any other thoughts or questions? All right. So what's happening? So this class, as I say, is class 1 of 5. And what we're going to do tonight is kind of set the stage for the class. Um, it's We're going to address the life of the Buddha. We're going to kind of, as I say, get all of sort of the basics out of the way and set the stage for the remaining classes. So there's not a lot of the philosophical teachings in the very first class. It's kind of setting up all of that context. So we'll begin by talking about the life of Siddhartha Gautama. This was the historical person who was born as Siddhartha Gautama and became known as the Buddha. The Buddha is not a name, it is a title. It means in English, the awakened one, or the one who is awake. Um, and we will, look at in more detail about what that means, but you could say awakened to the nature of reality, the ultimate nature of reality. You could say awakened to his own complete potential, his sort of a flourishing, a complete flourishing of his own enlightened, innate spiritual potential. And we will unpack those ideas in more detail as we go along. But he was given that title at a particular point in his life, and we'll get to that. Um, but he was born as Siddhartha Gautama, and he, in English, the word that you could give to the title that he was born into would be perhaps prince. Although when we say prince, it's not as grand as we imagine when we think of the kings and queens of England and France and so on. It is the case, though, that his family uh, sort of rule a perhaps fiefdom is an English word that gets at the meaning of what it was, or perhaps a small city state would be another way of thinking about it. He was born right around the border of India, what is present day India and what is present day Nepal. This was about 2,600 years ago. At that time, the regions were again these small city-states, but it is the case that his family ruled one of these city-states, and that succession was familial. So he would have inherited one of these city-states to govern. So that's why he's often referred to as a prince, because his father was the present ruler and the line of succession would have passed down to him. But again, it's quite humble compared to the grand sort of idea that we have of kings and queens. Uh, so that is what happened. He was born as a prince, and um, so when he was born, there were there are said to have been very auspicious signs that accompanied his birth. Who knows? But it seemed like he was very special from a very young age. And unfortunately, his mother passed away very shortly after the birth of Siddhartha Gautama. And his father was known to be someone who was very interested in this line of succession, in having Siddhartha become the ruler of this city state. And I guess, it was somewhat common for those of means to, as his family would have been comparatively speaking at the time, to go, have divinations performed, have prophecies kind of foretold by spiritual persons who existed in society at the time. So his father did take Siddhartha to one of these seers, one of these spiritual fortune tellers in a way. And this seer is said to have told his father that Siddhartha would grow up and follow one of two paths in life. In one path, he would follow his father in this line of succession. And if that were to come to pass, then Siddhartha would be successful in actually uniting all of these small city states into this vast sort of political, military, geopolitical dynasty, sort of conquer and combine and rule over a vast area because of his gifts, because of his his innate abilities. He would be successful in that way. Or this other path that he might take would be to follow a spiritual path and not a political path. And if he followed that path, it was said that he would be similarly successful in uniting large numbers of people all around this Indo-Tibetan, according to the way that we think about it now, Indo-Tibetan region. However, that kind of dynasty that he would create on the basis of that path would be a spiritual tie rather than a political tie or a military tie. And his father was not interested in that idea, this idea of this spiritual dynasty. He wanted this political dynasty. And so his father, as Siddhartha was growing up, his father tried to isolate him, tried to control his upbringing, so that he could, it was thought, have total control over the decisions that he would make and the choices that he would make. And that worked for quite some time. However, there came a point, in his maybe early 20s, when he decided to leave this you could say the compound where they lived. Again, quite a humble idea, but there were a number of buildings, some number of buildings, and comparatively speaking, they were quite well off. Um, and he lived his entire life there, and then left at some point to explore the local community, the local town, which he had never done before. So he lived quite a sheltered, isolated existence, just being exposed to his own family, some of the servants, and so on, never having experienced the wider world. And when he traveled into this town, he came across what are known as the four sights. And these were embodied by four different people that he came across. Um, and these can also be understood to be conditions of, at least three of these are sort of existential conditions that people face. So the first was someone who was extremely old, someone whose physical body was very affected by the ravages of old age. They were quite frail. The muscle tone of their body had diminished. They were feeble, and he hadn't experienced that kind of ravage to the body in his life up to that point, because he himself was quite young. His friends, his sibling, didn't have any siblings, but the other people that was surrounded with were probably 40, 50, probably not so much older than that. Certainly unlikely that someone was in their 80s and so on. Um, so that was one kind of shocking experience that he had. And he was quite old. We can all relate to these experiences. However, none of us were sheltered in that way. So we came to terms with all of these things at a young age, because we had grandparents, and just by going to restaurants and going to malls and things, we've seen all of these things from a very, very young age. But it's shocking when you make it to, your 20s before having ever been exposed to these things. So he traveled to this town with one of his attendants who was, likely around his same age. And he quizzed this attendant about this person who seemed to be suffering to some degree, on the basis of their physical condition. And, he asked if this was something that was very unusual, something that was very unexpected, something unique. And his attendant, having grown up in the town, is like us, and they knew that, well, no, that's just an elderly person. That's just someone who's been lucky enough to make it to the age of 80, 85, whatever it might have been. And yeah, their body has undergone dramatic change. And there is suffering attendant with that change, true. Um, and that was very surprising, very shocking to Siddhartha. And then he came across someone who was quite ill. This could have been someone maybe who had leprosy, who had some very visible signs of physical illness, boils perhaps. They were very, very clearly suffering from an illness. And again, very surprising to Siddhartha. So again, he quizzed his attendant, and again, his attendant said, absolutely, completely normal. There's many people in town who undergo various hardships from these sorts of diseases, pneumonia, again, leprosy, all of these sorts of diseases that are going around, could maybe dysentery, what have you. And again, very upsetting, very shocking to Siddhartha's mind. And then he saw a funeral procession, an open air funeral procession with the body in a cart, which is very common at the time, still actually very common in the Indo-Tibetan area for these large open air. You can see here in the picture a common, a present day depiction of that kind of tradition that's still going on, where they carry the body through the streets. And Siddhartha had never seen a dead body. He had never confronted the idea of death, which again, we can relate to all of these things. We can remember when we lost our first pet, when we lost a grandmother, a grandfather, and we went to our parents and we had this same sort of experience. But again, we were very, very young, and still it was upsetting, for us when we realized that that person was never coming back, that that animal was never coming back. And so he's grappling with all of these things at a pretty advanced age. So again, he's quizzing his attendant, and his attendant is saying, well, no, that's just a dead body. That person is no longer alive. They no longer exist in the world. So what he's seeing are these existential conditions of sickness, aging, and death, these things that all human beings have to face. They have to go through at various times. These sufferings, these changes, these experiences. And he realized that he himself was subject to sickness, aging, and death. And he realized that all of his loved ones were subject to sickness, aging, and death. And he became very motivated to try to find some solution to this problem. And so again, he's quite ordinary at this point. He's an ordinary person at this point. And he's, recognizing that these are sufferings that he has to confront, and is motivated, really interested in trying to find some solution. So he also comes across here, I put the word mendicant, spiritual mendicant, or spiritual seeker. There were in this region many existent spiritual traditions that predated. Of course, this was 2,600 years ago, but people have been grappling with these questions for thousands and for tens of thousands of years. So of course, there were well-developed spiritual systems that existed at the time. And it was quite common for people in this region at this time to do what's called going forth into homelessness, to wander, to just sort of give up everything and to wander, and to apply themselves to trying to answer, these questions, to find solutions to these questions. So he saw one of these spiritual seekers. And there was something, seems like there was something about this person, where they had a sense of peace, they had a sense of tranquility about them. And Siddhartha got a sense that maybe they were on to something, that maybe by following that model, he himself could uncover answers to these questions. He could find solutions to these problems. So he became interested in trying to overcome these issues of sickness, aging, and death. So that's a little bit about the life of the Buddha. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Didn't you say that there were 4 sites?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So an old person a sick person, a dead person, and then the spiritual mendicant is the fourth.
Oh, that was the site. Oh, okay. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thank
So
you.
when they say the four sites, basically they mean he came across four different people, um, but four different four different things that represented sickness, aging, and death, and then also you could say represented the spiritual path.
Okay, I got it.
So as I mentioned, the Buddha was born kind of on the border between as I say, present day India, present day Nepal, born in a town called Lumbini in actually present day Nepal, but just over the border between India, present day Nepal. And it's thought that there's some understanding that the story goes that his mother was walking over trees, quite pregnant, and just sort of gave birth at the side of the sidewalk or the walkway in this forested area by herself. And it's thought that they kind of understand where that took place. And there is a temple that has been erected at that site. And I just wanted to kind of show some pictures.
Wonderful, Dondrub. When
Yes.
you visit the site, like Lumbini and the other sacred sites, what are
Mhm.
supposed to be the benefits for the practitioners visiting those sites?
I mean, in general, it kind of depends on which, kind of exactly what you're, um, talking about in terms of which site and so on. In general, the idea is that, great practitioners have practiced in these places. And um, so there's kind of a spiritual energy that's built up. It also became pilgrimage sites. And so, in a way, sort of, it can maybe vary to some degree. Um, but in general, the idea is that great spiritual beings have been present there. And perhaps they've meditated there over and over and over again over now 2600 years, due to it being a pilgrimage site. So because the mind is connected to, because the mind is an energy that influences, at least to some degree, the environment that it's in, they're considered to kind of have built up sort of this store of blessing energy through all of the great masters. Of course, the Buddha, being, the fact that the Buddha himself was present in these locations because he was at least he was born there, in terms of Lumbini, in terms of the Maya Devi temple and so on. And then other places, became also pilgrimage sites and so on. So that's kind of the general idea, is that they've become blessed through the presence of many, many great spiritual beings, and of course, including the Buddha. So this is inside the Maya Devi temple. And again, inside the Maya Devi temple. And then this is, it's hard to tell from the picture, but this is sort of in a glass case that is also inside the temple. This is thought to be the paving stone where Maya gave birth, where the Buddha actually uh, was born, the paving stone on the trail, the path that where the Buddha was born. Who knows? But they've put it in this glass case, and that's how it's presented. So, so here I'm going to. So this is just a map um, of Lumbini. So you see here in the top is Lumbini, again, just over the border between, so you can see Kathmandu, there, and then Lumbini. And then at the bottom here, this is showing these dotted circles are showing Bodh Gaya. So Bodh Gaya is where the Buddha gave his first teaching. So now we're kind of jumping ahead. We talked about the 4 sites. We talked about why and how the Buddha became, or Siddhartha, not quite yet the Buddha, according to one way of thinking about it. Siddhartha became interested in spirituality, and so he did in fact go forth into homelessness, as I mentioned. So Siddhartha decided, on the basis of the 4 sites, Siddhartha decided to go forth into homelessness and to follow that spiritual path. And it's understood then that he followed this path of following, again, the spiritual traditions of the time. And really the spiritual traditions that existed were ones of asceticism, you could say, where the main spiritual tradition was one of asceticism. That was sort of the prevailing spiritual view at the time. And the Buddha engaged in this path. He followed this path of asceticism, and he found really that it didn't work particularly well. What was common was depriving the body of food, even going days without drinking, standing in fast-moving cold rivers, even beating the body, hitting the body. These sort of flagellistic kinds of practices. And the view was that if you punish the body, then the mind can transcend the body. And you'll find, not in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, but you can find in other traditions, that you come across images of what is known as the starving Buddha, a very emaciated form. And this actually, this is before the Buddha became the Buddha. This is actually Siddhartha. This is during Siddhartha's path of training, because he was following these existent traditions, and he was doing it as he was told to. And he was told to starve himself, do all of these things. And he found that his mind was dull, his mind was cloudy. It wasn't really effective, because of the lack of food, the lack of nourishment, and so on, the not sleeping, the pain. So there was a point in his training where this emaciated figure that you see in generally the Theravadan tradition has that particular form, artistic representation of this time in his life. He recognized that it wasn't working, and so he gave that up. And the story goes that he was trying to meditate by the side of a river, having, at this period where he was quite near death, having followed these extremely ascetic practices. And it's said that there was a raft coming down the river with a musician on the raft playing some sort of a stringed instrument. And this musician was producing this incredibly beautiful music from the perspective of Siddhartha, who was, hearing this music. And Siddhartha had this insight, this realization that this musician was able to produce this incredibly beautiful music because his instrument was tuned in the appropriate way, that the strings of his instrument had the right tension. If the strings were too loose, then this musician couldn't produce any sound. If the strings were too tight, the musician would produce a very harsh, discordant sound. And so he realized, Siddhartha did, that he had gone too far, that he was like this tightly wound instrument and not producing anything useful. And so what insight this gave rise to is one way of understanding, probably for the idea of the middle way. The middle way has other philosophical connotations, but one of those connotations is the middle way between laxity, or you could say laziness or sloth, versus like extreme asceticism, extreme practices. You don't want to, never meditate, never apply yourself, never have any self-discipline. But also the Buddha observed that you don't want to go in the opposite direction and never look after your body, never sleep, subject yourself to really painful conditions. These two extremes are both unproductive for spiritual growth. So at this stage, he began to eat, he began to take care of himself again. And he traveled then, as I said, he was a wanderer, right? He was a spiritual wanderer. So he ends up in a town in what is now present day India called Bodh Gaya. And so Bodh Gaya is this is a picture of, let's see. So this is a picture of the Bodhi tree in present day Bodh Gaya here. Let's see if I can make that. So this is the Bodhi tree. You've probably heard of the Bodhi tree. In Bodh Gaya, when Siddhartha arrived in Bodh Gaya, this particular tree is not the actual tree that existed at the time of the Buddha's life, being 2,600 years ago. This is understood to be something like a cutting of a cutting of a cutting, a descendant through cuttings or saplings of the original Bodhi tree. But it's still there in Bodh Gaya, the Bodhi tree, and it's thought to be an actual descendant of the tree where the Buddha meditated and in Bodh Gaya, and is said to have achieved his enlightenment in Bodh Gaya under the Bodhi tree. Bodhi, the word Bodhi, means awakening, or it means the mind of awakening or awakening. So yeah, it's the same root as Buddha, Bud. So Bodhi, Bud, they have the same root, and so awakening is the word. So it became known as the Bodhi tree, the place where the Buddha achieved his awakening. So the story goes that the Buddha sat under this tree and made this unshakable determination to not arise until he achieved enlightenment, and just meditated continuously under the Bodhi tree, and then achieved his enlightenment, his awakening in Bodh Gaya under the Bodhi tree. So then I have a couple of pictures again of present day Bodh Gaya. Again, these are all kind of monuments and things that have been erected in the centuries, millennia since, given the importance of this location as where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. So again, this is a statue that exists in Bodh Gaya depicting the Buddha. And this is, again, just another image, another map here. So here you can see in the lower right, you can see Bodh Gaya, and then you can just see the map, of course, it just came up with a route that was the most direct route from, on the bottom right, the town of Bodh Gaya, to the upper left, the town of Sarnath. So after the Buddha's enlightenment, the Buddha traveled from Bodh Gaya to Sarnath. And that was where he gave his first teaching. As you can see, there's a river between the two. So at some point, there's a bridge, I would assume, that the Buddha walked over. And again, I don't know exactly the path that he traveled, but he did travel from Bodh Gaya to Sarnath and gave his first teaching in Sarnath. And so these are photos now from Sarnath, also known as Varanasi. So again, these are just monuments, temples that have been erected in Sarnath, Varanasi, due to its historical significance as the place where his first discourse, his first teaching, after showing the aspect of achieving enlightenment under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya. So again, yes.
I was wondering, how long do you think it took him to achieve enlightenment? Because I sit down to meditate and I don't get enlightened. So I'm curious, like, how long it may have taken him, or do you think that he may have like had extraordinary qualities already? And so when he did it, he was like prime fruit, you know?
Yeah, so there are different historical ways of thinking about that, depending on the Buddhist spiritual tradition that you're talking about. In the Tibetan tradition, which is again the tradition that our center is based on, the understanding is actually that the Buddha was enlightened prior to even taking birth in that lifetime, because we discussed a little bit about how there are stories of these these signs of displayed even at an extremely young age, like you were saying, this sort of ripening that was there. And so, but not all Buddhist traditions present that as the understanding. That is the understanding as it's presented in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Other Buddhist traditions will present the view that he was completely ordinary when he was born. Maybe he had some karmic predispositions, but that he would be considered ordinary. relatively speaking, and actually did accomplish enlightenment under the Bodhi tree in Bodh Gaya. So that would mean, that over a period of years, just a number of years during the training process where he was cultivating those qualities. So, I mean, either way, certainly there were karmic predispositions at play, but the Tibetan Buddhist view is that his whole life was the life of an enlightened being, and that's why I used the phrase showing the aspect of achieving enlightenment, because that's how it's understood in our tradition, is that even when he went forth, when he was younger, he was doing all of those things as a teaching, as a way of demonstrating, well, if you want to take this seriously, don't get wrapped up in titles, don't get wrapped up in trying to, get land, get money. Really focus on your spiritual goals, your spiritual life. That should be your main focus. So that's the Tibetan Buddhist view, is that his mind was an enlightened mind prior to his birth, and his mind associated with a form in order to teach, in order to help.
Thank you. That sits better with me. Yeah.
And these are just some of the temples and things that exist in Varanasi. So then what he taught, what his first teaching was on in Sarnath or Varanasi, is on the Four Noble Truths. That was the topic of his first discourse, and we've all probably, in school, seventh grade civics and whatnot, we've all heard of the Four Noble Truths. So we're going to start now thinking a bit about Buddhist philosophy, and we're going to go in more detail in all of the subsequent classes. But that is the focus is on the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths, you could say, is really a blueprint of everything that the Buddha taught. All of his teachings, everything that he said after this first discourse, you could describe as being an elaboration of one of the Four Noble Truths. Things get complicated kind of right off the bat, though, even just with the phrase, the Four Noble Truths. Because what you'll find if you study Buddhism for any period of time is that because we're English speakers, we are relying on translators and interpreters who are looking at primary sources that are Tibetan, perhaps in origin, in terms of the language, or perhaps they are Sanskrit in origin, in terms of the language, or they are Tibetan, which it itself is from Sanskrit. So originally, of course, this is kind of an aside, but for hundreds of years, the teachings were passed down orally from disciple to student. They weren't written down. They were passed down orally for a long time. Eventually, they would become to be written down. And when that happened, there were two main languages that they were written down in initially. Sanskrit and Pali were these two written languages that the teachings were written down in. And so you have what's called the Sanskrit canon, and you have the Pali canon. Tibetan Buddhism is based on the Sanskrit canon. The Theravadan tradition, which we'll talk about a little bit before we end tonight, is based on the Pali canon, or collection of teachings. So as I was saying, for us, what you find is, because we can't read Sanskrit, we can't read Pali, we can't read Tibetan, at least I can't, we read English. So we're relying on people who looked at the Tibetan or the Sanskrit or the Pali and had to figure out an English word to get at what was being said in Sanskrit or Tibetan or Pali. Or, as I said, Tibetan. Also, we also rely on Tibetan scholars who had to look at the Sanskrit and then find a Tibetan word that means kind of what the Sanskrit word means. And then we have an English word that kind of means what the Tibetan word means, that kind of means what the Sanskrit word means. So it's, there's a lot of complication that comes with the study of this. And the word noble, what I'm getting to, in particular, is the word noble. Here is one of these complications. And it's an example of the fact that as you study Buddhism, you'll find that there are many English words that have a colloquial English meaning that doesn't really get at what is meant, that it's a technical word. In Tibetan Buddhism, that doesn't really connect very well to English that we're having to use. And noble is an example of that, because when we think noble, we think, oh, dignified, or rarefied or special in some way. Like these four truths have nobility. They have some kind of dignified, rarefied essence to them. And it doesn't mean that at all. It's a translation of the word Arya. The word noble is a translation of the word Arya. And an Arya is a type of practitioner. It's a type of spiritual person. And when I say type, what I mean is it is a spiritual practitioner who has developed in their mind a particular level of spiritual insight, spiritual realization. And so they are known as Arya beings. Noble in English, a noble being, an Arya being. And so the Four Noble Truths are the four things that are known to be true for those who have reached this level of spiritual development, spiritual insight, spiritual realization. They look at the world and they see the world as being characterized or true in these four ways. So it gets, kind of goes right off the rails, kind of right from the beginning. It gets complicated, even just with what the Four Noble Truths mean. That's what we're going to think about. Are there any thoughts or questions? I haven't asked specifically for questions in a little bit.
I've heard in teachings that Tibetan and Sanskrit are like imbued with kind of blessed properties from the language. Is that the same for the Theravadins with Pali?
So I know that Sanskrit in particular, is understood to have been kind of a constructed language, a language constructed by spiritual practitioners, and the resonance of that, which is why in Tibetan Buddhism, mantra is always Sanskrit. Mantra is when a person recites mantra. You've probably heard like the mantra Om Mani Padme Hum. You you may have heard other mantras, they're always Sanskrit syllables because the resonance of those syllables have, as you're saying, they are understood to have been intentionally constructed because the resonance of those syllables have a beneficial energetic effect on the mind. That's certainly true. The Tibetan language, I'm not sure. I don't know that I've heard it presented in the same way, and I don't know how the cultures in Theravadan society. Um, I don't know how because again, Tibetan Buddhism is based on the Sanskrit canon. So I just honestly don't know how the cultures where Theravada is predominant, I don't know what their relationship is to the Pali language. I don't know. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, so the Four Noble Truths are, I'm not quite ready for the first of the four yet, so we'll just stay here. So, okay, so the four things that are known to be true by the Aryas, the ones who've reached this level of insight, this level of spiritual depth or insight, they look at the world and they see it as being true in these four ways. So there's different translations of these four into English. One is, the truth of suffering, the truth of the origination or the origin of suffering, the truth of the cessation of suffering, and then the truth of the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. Another way of talking about it, though, that I think is particularly useful is true suffering, true origins, true cessations, and true paths. As a way of thinking about it, I think thinking about it in that way is quite helpful because, in a way, we as ordinary beings, we all are looking at the world, right? We're also observing the world, and we also have a version, not aversion, not animosity toward, but a version of the four truths. Like these, we also would agree that there is suffering. We would agree that there are reasons why there is suffering. We would also agree that there are things that you can do to reduce suffering. And we would agree that we would agree that it's possible to reduce suffering. And we would agree that there are mechanisms that you could put into place to accomplish that goal, even as ordinary beings. However, our version of these four truths is different than the version of these four truths that an Arya being is going to present. We, as ordinary beings, are going to define these four things differently. We are going to think that suffering, largely speaking, we're going to define suffering as things like poverty, things like, war, things like not being able to have the kind of career that you want, not being able to be in the world, having to work a job that you don't enjoy, not having satisfying relationships. We're going to define it largely as circumstances, as things that are happening to us, and things, conditions that exist in the world, these sort of external painful experiences or deprivations that we are subject to. And then we're going to think, okay, well, given that suffering is not having access to resources, not being able to, kind of be in the world the way that I enjoy being in the world, not being able to, then the way of responding to that is to get an education, to save money, to amass kind of a safety net, to try to cultivate a social network that is supportive of our interests. We're going to kind of try to manage our access to resources and our education and our bank balance and our investments in a way to provide a measure of comfort and stability and access to resources. And from the Arya's perspective, that's an incredibly surface level understanding of these truths. Comparatively speaking, there are advantages to not being in a war zone. There are advantages to having enough to eat compared to not having enough to eat. There are advantages to having a safe, warm, home to live in. There are advantages to having good friends, good food, etc. A good education that opens doors. Comparatively speaking, between having or not having, there are some advantages to having those and so on. But that level of understanding happiness and that level of understanding suffering is incredibly shallow and incredibly surface level compared to the depths of what is really going on. And that those methods that we think of in terms of pursuing a good education, pursuing wealth, pursuing status, those as methods, they're not very effective. They're very temporary, and we'll see as we go along, our ability even to achieve that is not controlled as much as we think it is by the effort that we put into it. There are deeper causes of what allows a person to be successful even when they want to try to get a good education, or they want to be successful in business, or they want, we think that, well, if we just make a strong effort, then that will happen. But we see, of course, there are many examples of all of those obstacles that arise. Why do those obstacles arise? Why do some people, when they pursue a particular course of action, they find that there are relatively few obstacles? Other people have the same drive, the same ambition, they pursue that same course, they find all kinds of obstacles arising. So we'll look into the causes of those obstacles and realize that there are ways, even if we want that kind of temporary level of success and that kind of temporary level of comfort and so on, that in order to be successful, there are ways of actually cultivating the true causes of those things that we don't really understand, that this surface level presentation isn't presenting us with, that we need to understand, even if that is the goal that we have. So what is important is to recognize or truths the four truths of Arya beings are very, very different. And from the Buddhist perspective, that's a problem because these Arya beings have developed their minds, they've developed their ability to perceive, to have insight, and we haven't to that level. So we are misunderstanding things that they are seeing more clearly. Um, and it's better to see things more clearly than it is to see things less clearly. Because the more clearly you see things, the more accurately you're going to be able to address these four things, the more effective you will be in actually solving these issues. And that's the whole point of why the Buddha taught. It isn't to be depressing. It isn't to be like, oh, sometimes, as I mentioned, sometimes the first noble truth is presented in English as life is suffering, which really isn't a good understanding of, this, because the whole point of the Four Noble Truths is to understand that that for ordinary sentient beings like us, we do meet with obstacles, we do meet with difficulty, but we can understand, first, we can understand how deep that goes. Secondly, we can understand why that is. And then we can understand that although that is true, that it's not inevitable. It's not something that we are stuck with without any choice, without any ability to change. And then we actually can get to the point where we understand specifically what it is that I should do in order to overcome suffering. So that's what the Buddha taught. Everything, as I said, everything that he taught is an elaboration of one of the Four Noble Truths. So he does want us to understand suffering, but he also wants us to understand why there is suffering. And then he wants us to understand that that suffering isn't inevitable. And he wants us to understand what it is that we can begin to do to put an end to that suffering. That's the end goal. That's why the Buddha taught, is to demonstrate how to put an end to suffering. So in the same way that a heart surgeon has to understand very, very deeply all of the things that can go wrong with a person's heart, he or she isn't doing that just to be a downer, just to be a bummer about like, well, this can go wrong and that can go wrong. And if you do this, then that will happen. It's to actually learn how to help people. It's to actually learn how to correct the things that can go wrong. If there was nothing that heart surgeons could do to correct all of the things that can go wrong, they wouldn't exist as a profession. There would be no point. And there would be no point to the Buddha's teaching if he wasn't also able to be like, this is what you do. This is how you put an end to it. This is what is actually effective, because what we're doing, given our surface level understanding, is not effective. It's very, very minorly effective and only effective for very short periods of time. The antidotes that we are employing are mistaken in a way. They don't go deep enough. They're not effective enough. The Aryas are saying, pay attention here, wake up to this deeper reality. And by doing that, learn how to apply more effective antidotes. So the first of the Four Noble Truths is depressing, as I said, but that's not the point. The point is to understand it to a deeper level so that we can come to understand that in order to uproot it, I have to have deep methods. I have to have deep antidotes. So true suffering is the first of the Four Noble Truths. And so true suffering has three types: the suffering of pain, the suffering of change, and all pervasive suffering is three categories of the first noble truth of true suffering. So again, if we want to understand what really is suffering, it's not just not having access to resources, not just not being able to pursue the hobbies or the career that we might ultimately enjoy more than anything else. It isn't trying to have the best, boyfriend or girlfriend or husband or wife or what have you, the best relationships. All of those kinds of overt circumstantial things fall under this first category, the suffering of pain. The suffering of pain is any kind of physical or mental unwanted experience. If you were to ask a person on the street what is suffering, they would say, when my dog dies, when I get fired, when I can't eat the kinds of food that I enjoy, when I can't go on vacation, when it's raining and I would like to go to the amusement park, but I can't, when I'm cooped up inside, because it's freezing out and I just want to be able to enjoy the beach. Anything that's an actual overt, and of course there are levels of that. Some of those are annoyances, some of those are devastating, life-changing, painful conditions. So it exists on a spectrum, but they are overt physical or mental unwanted experiences. And the problem is that we think that that's it. We think that that is suffering and that there is nothing else other than that. But you can see that there's two more categories of suffering that the Arya beings are telling us are suffering. And those, the second is perhaps the most important. The second is what's called the suffering of change or changeable suffering. And changeable suffering is critically important philosophically from the Buddhist perspective, because everything on this list would be something that, again, if you were to go onto the street and you were to ask a person now, the question is, what is happiness? And that person would say, getting a good job, or living in a good neighborhood, or being able to eat, whatever I want, whenever I want, that I find pleasant and tasty, or really good weather, or loving family relationships, being taken care of, feeling, loved. And the problem is that, being, if I want to see a movie, I can go see the movie. If I want to go to the symphony, I can go and see the symphony. Having access to all of these pleasant experiences is happiness for an ordinary being. And the problem is that the Arya beings are looking at that same experience that we are labeling as happiness, and that we are really devoting all of our time and all of our resources and all of our money and all of our effort into accumulating wealth and status and reputation and all of these things that we think are giving us conducive, beneficial, pleasant experiences. And the Aryas are saying, what you're experiencing is the suffering of change. And it's the suffering of change in two ways. One is that it doesn't last. The job, the house, the relationship, whether it's a husband or a wife or a best friend, the the food, that particular meal, none of these experiences are permanent. They're going to change. Again, the suffering of change, right? that meal is going to end, that relationship is going to end, that movie is going to end. And if we become sort of addicted to pursuing, accumulating all of these external circumstances, then when they end, as they do, we will suffer. When that relationship ends, when we can't, when we can't see what we want to see, when we can't taste what we want to taste, if we habituate our minds to thinking that that's happiness and my whole reason for being is accumulating these experiences, every time we're thwarted, every time things don't work out the way that we want them to, because by definition, these are very fleeting, really sensory kinds of experiences, we're going to experience pain. But also, on a deeper level, these experiences are the suffering of change, because even if we were able to elongate these experiences, they would themselves become unpleasant to experience in our own mind, with nothing happening. So if you think about the person that you most enjoy spending time with in the whole world, or you think about the meal that you most enjoy eating in the whole world, or the vacation spot that you most enjoy visiting, the city, whatever. And then if you imagine that you could never do anything else, that even if it was, let's say you really want to go to Paris, or you really love the beach, or you really love, your dearest best friend, if you never could be separated from experiencing that food, that city, that person, that beach, whatever it is, if there were no other experiences that could ever be part of your life, you would reach a point, and that point might be different for different experiences, but you would reach a point where you were really tired of that experience, where you were really motivated to do something else, to eat something else, to talk to somebody else, to go do something else. Sorry, was there a question? Okay, so yeah, so that would arise in your own mind, even though all you're doing is being in contact with the thing that you described or decided internally was happiness, right? You said going to the beach was happiness. You said hanging out with my best friend is happiness. But if that's the only experience that you're capable of having, you're going to rebel against that experience. You're going to feel distress at some point. So this, psychologically, this is really an important teaching, because what the Buddha, well, what Arya beings, the Buddha is someone who's reached that level and even gone beyond that. But at least what Arya beings are saying is, psychologically, what's happening here is that we are initially, we are dissatisfied with the present moment, right? Whatever is happening, we are bored, we are anxious, we are hungry, we are dissatisfied. So we engage in a pleasure-seeking behavior. We call someone, we eat something, we go somewhere, we try to change the present moment. We try to bring something new into our experience because we've labeled that external event or circumstance as happiness. And we think the present moment is not great. If I could go do this or have this or eat this or drink this, I will be happy. And initially, we are introducing a new stimulus then into our experience. And that present, the dissatisfaction that we were experiencing, the boredom, the anxiety, whatever it is, it does momentarily decrease. We become distracted by the introduction of this new stimulus, being able to go to the movie, being able to eat the food, whatever it might be. However, what these Arya beings are saying is that any stimulus that you can point to is going to come along with its own suffering. And the more that you engage in that experience in an uninterrupted fashion, the stronger that signal of its own attendant suffering is going to become. If you imagine going to the movie theater, watching the movie, and then not being allowed to leave, you get tied down to the seat and the movie starts over again. You thought that that movie was going to make you happy, right? And then you saw it. And if you were right, if that was true, then the second time you saw it, you'd get happier than the first time you saw it, because the stimulus, the activity, is actually in the nature of happiness, which is what you thought it was. However, if you repeat that experience again and then again and again, you're going to get more and more agitated. You're going to get more and more distressed. Same if you're in a locked room with your best friend. Same if you can only eat the one meal for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Because all of these experiences are external to oneself, and they're not in the nature of happiness. And they come with their own attendant suffering. And that becomes louder and louder the more you engage with it. Rather than you becoming happier and happier, you become less and less happy. So what you labeled as happiness actually changes into suffering the more that you engage with it, which means that we're wrong. It means that because we're not an Arya being, we're not seeing things clearly, and we're labeling things as happiness that are not happiness. And then all pervasive suffering just means that there are no sentient beings like us who are living or who are having a life that is not conditioned by the first two ways of understanding suffering. Every ordinary sentient being is meeting with difficult, painful circumstances, and they're meeting with things that are relatively, better, but also would fall under the category of the suffering of change. So all pervasive suffering means that it's inescapable for ordinary sentient beings, not inescapable for any kind of being, but inescapable for ordinary sentient beings like us. So that's the first of the Four Noble Truths. Okay, so then true causation is the second noble truth. So true causation or true origination is the second noble truth. And what this is getting at is that unlike, again, we think as ordinary sentient beings, we think that the cause of our suffering is not having the right education, not having enough money, not having the right relationship, etc. These external causes. The Arya beings say, no, the cause of your suffering is internal. It's in the mind, and it's based on these three, what they call the three root delusions, the three root poisons of anger, attachment, and ignorance. And these are concepts that we will elaborate on as we go along. These are states of mind that condition how we interpret the world. They condition how we react to things. They condition the kinds of actions that we engage in. We know that when there's deep anger in the mind, that it can be a beautiful day. People can be saying nice things, but we're not having any fun. Like our mind is poisoned by that lens that we are interpreting the world through. Um, and so we will unpack the influence of these mental states. So rather than focusing on, in order to be happy, I need to have enough wealth and enough status and so on, the Aryas are saying, no, you need to change your mind. You need to address these internal root causes of your suffering and how these root causes give rise to actions that are perpetuating your suffering. So, okay. So then true cessation. So
what is the third Arya truth?
So the true suffering, true origins, true cessations, and then true paths. So this is the third here, true cessations. So true suffering, true origin or cause, true cessation, and true paths. So true cessation is this third. I know we're just about out of time, but I'm going to try to just very briefly address true cessation and true paths. So I just need a couple more minutes. I try not to keep you. So true cessation is where things start to get better. So we've understood true, what is suffering is the three types of suffering, suffering of pain, suffering of change, all pervasive suffering. That is how we need to understand what really suffering is. Then we need to understand that its cause is not external, its cause is internal. Its cause is the mental states that are arising in the mind and the actions that we engage in when we're under the influence of those states. So that's all kind of a bummer, right? There is suffering, this is how you understand it, and these are the internal causes. However, the Buddha also said, well, here the good news is that there are ways in which you can cause these internal mental states that are problematic. You can cause them to completely cease, which is where true cessation comes from. You can completely eliminate these painful mental states from the mind. And when you do that, because they were the origin, they were the cause of your suffering, now you've eliminated the first noble truth. You've eliminated suffering itself. And the Buddha taught two paths. The Buddha taught two results, two ways in which true cessations arise. They arise either in the state of nirvana or they arise in the state of full enlightenment. Nirvana is the path of training that the Theravada tradition is presenting. The practitioners of the Theravada tradition are pursuing nirvana, which is a path validly taught by the Buddha for arriving at true cessation. The Buddha also taught the path of full enlightenment, which is the path that the Mahayana practitioners are pursuing. So Mahayana means universal vehicle or great vehicle. The Theravada itself means tradition of the elders, but what they are pursuing is, you could say, the individual vehicle rather than the universal vehicle or the great vehicle. And we'll look at that a little bit later. And it basically comes down to the differences between the Pali canon and the Sanskrit canon. In a way, the really detailed methods for achieving enlightenment were taught to a certain group of practitioners, and that ended up getting memorialized in the Sanskrit canon, but kind of not so much in the Pali canon. And so the path of practice that's followed in the Theravadan tradition is the path of nirvana. The path of enlightenment, full enlightenment, is the path that's followed largely by the majority of the people in the Mahayana tradition, which is, again, what Tibetan Buddhism is an example of. Zen tradition is another example of a Mahayana school. Okay, so how do we do that? How do we accomplish either, broadly speaking, what is it that a practitioner does that results in either nirvana or enlightenment? There are three trainings. These are called the three higher trainings. We have to have a basis of ethics, we have to develop meditative concentration, and we have to develop our wisdom. And it's really the wisdom teachings where you find some distinction between, the way that the wisdom teachings are implemented in a way is where you find some distinction between the path of nirvana and the path of Mahayana. There are methods for using the wisdom teachings to achieve full enlightenment that exist in the Mahayana tradition that don't really exist in the Theravada tradition. And we'll make sense of that as we go along. But all Buddhist practitioners, regardless of what school they're in, if they want to arrive at a true cessation, they have to develop ethics, they have to develop meditative concentration, and they have to develop really penetrative wisdom insight. Okay, so here we have these three vehicles of Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. So we've talked about Hinayana and Mahayana, and Vajrayana is a subset of Tibetan Buddhism. It means the diamond vehicle, and that is where you find these techniques. Really, Vajrayana, what Vajrayana is doing is it's presenting meditative techniques that work with the subtle energy system of the body and mind in a way that allows the practitioner to use their meditative insight on wisdom to eliminate what are called the obstacles to omniscience, or and that's where you find a distinction between Theravada and Mahayana, is that these specific techniques are presented in the Vajrayana tradition, and they're kind of unique to that tradition. But we'll unpack that a little bit as we go along. But you understand it as a subset of Tibetan Buddhism, really. It's not a separate. It's a vehicle in the sense yana means vehicle. So Hinayana. So Hinayana is the same. It's similar to the idea of Theravada. It's just Theravada means the tradition of the elders. Hinayana, actually, the technical definition means lesser vehicle, and Mahayana means greater vehicle. But that has come to have some almost derogatory overtones, this idea of lesser versus greater. So generally Theravada, as I said, because it means tradition of the elders, it's a more polite, it's understood to be a politer way to refer to practitioners in those schools. It does have a more technical philosophical meaning because they're at the time of the Buddha or shortly thereafter, there came to be many different philosophical schools, and most of them disappeared. But Hinayana as it was labeled by the Mahayanists, Hinayana was the surviving Theravada school. So it does have a more specific technical meaning. So in a way, Theravada could encapsulate different schools, but Hinayana is the only one that kind of survived over time. The other ones sort of died out. And basically, that just gets to the fact that humans are really good at coming up with distinctions. Even within Tibetan Buddhism, you've got four traditions. You have the Gelug, the Sakya, the Nyingma, and the Kagyu. And even within those, you've got some minor subdivisions. Humans are just really good at packaging things, differently. So you did at one time have 18 different schools, philosophical schools, and then those got whittled down over time. Okay. And then you have this idea of the three baskets, and this is the last thing that we'll talk about. You've got the Vinaya basket, the Sutra basket, and the Abhidharma basket. The Vinaya basket is where the Buddha taught ethics really for monks and nuns. Sutra basket are all of the publicly available teachings, all of the major public discourses of the Buddha, and then the Abhidharma is really kind of Buddhist cosmology, and we're not really going to touch on Abhidharma in this class at all, but you can talk about all of the Buddhist teachings as falling into one of these baskets. Okay, and that's it for today. I'm sorry that I went over, but I'm happy to answer any, or try to answer any questions that have come up if there are any. I'm not in a hurry, but I apologize for taking your time. Yes.
Yeah, so I have a question. If I'm working the Mahayana way, should I expect, I mean, obviously I'm not saying now or anytime soon, but should I expect to get to nirvana before I get to enlightenment?
So
Or get to enlightenment first?
So essentially, because enlightenment is what Mahayana practitioners, that is the goal of a Mahayana practitioner. So in a way, person in the Mahayana tradition, the intent is that their practice is directly aimed at enlightenment. So you don't have to go through nirvana. You kind of bypass nirvana and you go right to full enlightenment. They're both, as I say, they're both true cessations, but the way that it's presented is that, as I said, as I mentioned, a practitioner can achieve nirvana, which is a valid path taught by the Buddha in there, and it is a true cessation. That practitioner, that being no longer suffers in any way because it's a true cessation. They have achieved a true cessation. But what they haven't done is eliminated what are called the subtle obscurations to omniscience. And those subtle obscurations to omniscience don't prevent that practitioner from nirvana. So it's complicated, but broadly speaking, what that means is that their mind achieves nirvana. The body doesn't achieve nirvana. Body and mind are two different phenomena. And the mind, through training, if they're practicing in the Theravada tradition, they can validly achieve the state of nirvana. And that is a true cessation. However, even though that mind is abiding in the state of nirvana, which is a state of completely beyond suffering, there exist in that nirvanic mind these subtle obscurations to omniscience. And so they are not a fully enlightened being. But practically speaking, the difference is a mind that has achieved full enlightenment is a mind that is capable of intentionally taking rebirth into the ordinary places where ordinary sentient beings exist. And they do that like the historical Buddha. Again, from the Tibetan Buddhist perspective, the historical Buddha is an example of enlightened mind doing that, intentionally taking birth into a place for us, this world that was populated by ordinary sentient beings, in order to teach those ordinary sentient beings how they themselves can achieve enlightenment. And a nirvanic being is prevented from doing that. A nirvanic being, their mind, it does not suffer, but their mind is separated from that ability to take rebirth for the benefit of ordinary sentient beings. So that's really the difference between those two kinds of mind. Neither mind is suffering, neither mind is experiencing suffering, but fully enlightened mind can take rebirth in order to benefit sentient beings. Nirvanic mind is kind of blocked from that ability.
Doing the rebirth and all of that. Oh, okay. All right. So, being on the Mahayana path, you can bypass the nirvana altogether and just go straight for enlightenment. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Just wondering. Just trying to figure out what's going on. So,
Are there any other questions?
Venerable Dondrub, do all the Buddhist traditions have the three higher trainings and they just focus differently?
Yes. So every Buddhist practitioner there's an understanding that ethics is the foundation of all Buddhist training. Without ethics, training in Buddhist spirituality is meaningless and it has no power. All Buddhist traditions are meditative, have a meditative core. There's an understanding that we have to develop over time, not like next week, but over time, gradually, we have to train the mind to accomplish levels of meditative concentration, meditative stability that are very, very advanced, very deep. And the reason that we have to do that is because we have to develop penetrative wisdom insight. And the mind that we possess at the moment is not stable. The mind that we possess at the moment doesn't have that level of concentration. And so, just like if you go to the library and you put on rock music and metal and you try to learn something, you're not going to be very successful if we don't develop meditative skill, meditative stabilization. We will be blocked from certain levels of spiritual insight, certain levels of spiritual development. So it's, as I said, it's really kind of the Vajrayana teachings where those wisdom insights are applied using very special techniques that relate to the energy, the subtle energy system of the body. That's where you can progress from, because there's no difference there. The kind of insight that a Theravada practitioner has in terms of the wisdom teachings is the same insight that a Mahayana practitioner needs to have. But the Mahayana practitioner is using these Vajrayana techniques, and that is allowing them to get rid of or to purify these subtle obscurations to omniscience. But broadly speaking, wisdom and ethics and meditative stabilization are the bedrock of all Buddhist teachings.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, so we'll leave it there for today, and we will pick it up next week. We'll go into more detail on all of these things. As I say, really what we're going to look at in more detail, the Four Noble Truths are the blueprint for all of the Buddhist teachings. So we're going to understand all of the Four Noble Truths in more detail, in a sort of very broad way as we go through the course. All right, well, thanks for coming. I hope to see everybody next week. Have a great weekend.
Thank you so much, Venerable Dondrub. This was so helpful.
Oh,
Really
good.
lovely.